Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker podcast, bringing you fun and soulful interviews with spiritual teachers with the aim of tuning you in and lighting you up. You can access all episodes of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos and interviews all about finding and following your life purpose. My name is George Lizos. I'm a spiritual teacher, intuitive, the author of Be the Guru, and the #1 best-selling Lightworkers Gotta Work. And today I have with me David Hamilton. David has a PhD in organic chemistry and worked in the pharmaceutical industry, developing drugs for cardiovascular disease and cancer. Inspired by the placebo effect, he left the industry to write and educate around how to harness our mind and emotions to improve our health. He's now a best-selling author of 11 books and has been featured on Channel 4's Sunday Brunch and on CBS Sunday Morning in the US. David, welcome to the Lit Up Lightworker podcast.
Thank you, George. And, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh my God, I'm so excited to chat on the podcast. I mean, I've known you for a few years via my work with Hay House, and then we've had so many chats, but I'm so excited to chat about your new book, which I think is so exciting. It's a question everybody asks within the spiritual field, which is, what is the science behind all these quote unquote woo-woo stuff that we talk about, like crystals and energy healing and meditation, etc. So before we dive into it, I'm curious, what was your inspiration and your desire around writing this book?
The book came around in the strangest way for me, actually, because as you know, having previously worked in publishing yourself, normally an author comes in with an idea and pitches a book. And I've done that, 10 times for my other 10 books. But this time, I didn't have an idea. Usually, because I usually get an idea for the next book while I'm writing a previous one, and I find research that doesn't quite fit the context of the one I'm working on, so I kind of park it, and I say, I think I could build a book around that idea. It's really interesting. I'll put it to the side right now. But that hadn't happened this time. And so I asked for a meeting with Michelle Pilley, the MD of Hay House in the UK, because Michelle's always got her ear to the ground, and I think she knows, what do people want. So I basically went to Michelle with my heart open, and my idea was, how can I serve? And I basically said to Michelle, given what you see my skill set to be, how do you think I could best serve readers out there? What could I best do to answer a question that people have, or to give people what would be of real value? Because normally the author thinks, this is what I think people like, and then I'll go write it. So this time it was the opposite way around, and I basically asked Michelle, how do you think I could best serve, given what you know about the questions people are asking in publishing right now? And she said, well, I was actually thinking something like why woo-woo works. And we both laughed, because Michelle said, obviously we'll not call it that. But it was funny, and I said, yeah, I'm not calling it why woo-woo works. But it's funny how the name just kind of stuck. And the more people in Hay House and in marketing people Michelle mentioned it to, everyone said, I really love that name. And then people I mentioned it to said, I really love that name. And it just sort of stuck. So it kind of came around in a strange kind of way.
And it stuck perfectly, because this is a term that we all use in the spiritual industry, like playfully with one another, like we're into woo-woo stuff, like we're professional woo-woos. But so it makes perfect sense to ask a question around that. So talking about the science behind it. So there are different books out there. You write about the science and spirituality and where they meet, etc. But when it comes to like energy healing, crystals, meditation, what I've heard from people is, some people are like, yes, there is definite science about it. Some people are like, well, there are theories that haven't been proven. There are quantum physics theories to suggest that, but they haven't been proven on a bigger scale. So just a general question, just to set the tone of this interview. Is there science behind woo-woo stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. And for some subjects, there are clinical studies, like for example Reiki, and other things like therapeutic touch and these kind of things. There's lots and lots of studies that have been done, even with hospital patients, which show reductions in pain and reductions, improvements in mental health in comparison with people not receiving the Reiki. For some other subjects, like crystals, where there wasn't any clinical stuff, what I did is explain how they work for us. because science, you can show something in different ways in science. You can actually show something with a scientific study with people, with patients, for example, or you can do something where you actually you explain how a principle works. With crystals, for example, there's 3 distinct ways that scientifically you can say they work. Because, one way with crystals, if I got one, I had one handy there as a prop here. For example, a crystal that's really clear works in cognitive psychology as what you might call a mental representation. So like a mental representation is when something represents something else. So in the Buddhist teachings of Dzogchen, a clear crystal, high clarity, is a representation for the state of mind and the state of being that one wishes to attain. So the moment one puts their attention on the clear crystal and it's now attached to an idea, this is the state of clarity. It then becomes a mental representation, becomes a focus. It becomes easier to focus on that which you wish to attain because its clarity is representative of that. So in the book, I explained some of the science and research around that idea. And also what I did is clear up some of the misunderstandings that people who are skeptical of crystals have, because sometimes you find in healing and spirituality and energy work, it's not that there's no science available, it's just people misunderstand the language. Like people who work in the spiritual arts, for example, might use a particular set of language to explain something, but people in science and in other professional areas they don't know that language. So it sounds as if they're talking woo-woo. So what I also did in the book is show the language is really just 2 different ways of understanding the same phenomena. And when you stitch the language together, what I think I've done quite well, at least in the crystals chapter that we're talking about here, is help to bring, people who work with crystals and people who might be skeptical a bit together and say, wow, that's really interesting. I even tested this out with doctors and professionals to see what they thought, who might be quite skeptical. And this is really quite interesting. Actually, I hadn't realized that that's when someone says I'm programming a crystal. I didn't realize that's what they meant. And so I cleared up the language barriers and got rid of the language barriers and showed how these kind of things work. So
I think that's so interesting that you essentially created a middle ground where I call them lovingly, quote unquote, muggles and also woo-woo people can come together, so we're able to communicate with one another and find like common ground on our belief systems, and realize that just because we use certain words that are more niche or that are more specific, it doesn't mean that it's something completely different or quote unquote magical from what you're understanding as well.
Exactly. That was one of my goals actually for this book, George, was to try to find common ground, because it doesn't have to be this or that. What I've actually said through the book, it doesn't have to be all mainstream and no alternative, or it also doesn't have to be all alternative and no mainstream. What about a bit of middle ground, when sometimes it's more of this and less of that, but other times it's less of that, more of that and less of this one. Sometimes it's in the middle of the 2, but there's always a fusion to be had. And so what I tried to do in the book is bring these 2 seemingly separate worlds together and say, we can work together in this. There is a lot of common ground and a lot of benefit for these, energy practices and crystals and all these different things. There is a lot of practical use and benefit from these things.
It's such an important conversation to have, especially now that we're transitioning into like more and more people are opening to this kind of stuff, and they need something more scientific, for example, in the beginning to help them step into it and to give them permission to step into it. Now, one of the most popular alternative therapies out there, it's energy healing, whether it's Reiki, whether it's pranic healing, whether it's whatever type of healing. There's a lot of chat and a lot of people that actually train to become energy healers. I'm a Reiki master myself, so I've always wondered, and people always ask me, what is the science behind Reiki? And I always say, like, it's life force energy. Okay, but how do you explain that from a scientific perspective? How do you explain that in the book?
Well, first of all, I'm also a Reiki master.
Oh, perfect. I didn't know that.
It's funny. It's not something it's not a conversation I ever really had with scientists and stuff, but I trained in Reiki about 20 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and I've not practiced it for a while. I've dabbled in a number of different healing arts over the years. But, you know, to clear up in terms of energy healing, skeptics often have an issue with the word, you know, bioenergy or biofield and all that. So I addressed this in the book. And I pointed out that, again, it's this language thing. So a biofield is just an electric or magnetic field that's generated by a biological organism. And that's it. There's nothing woo. It sounds woo-woo, but it's not woo-woo. Like if I had to plug my phone into the wall to charge it, then I'm using a physical electric field. But, and so the electric field is generated by the circuitry, by the stuff in the house, by the power generation stuff in the house, however that works. But if you generate the electric or magnetic field from a biological organism, i.e. a cell or in the body, which really occurs through the movement of calcium and sodium and potassium through ion channels in cells, that generates an electric field. But you don't call it a normal electric field because it's not generated by a wall socket. It's generated by a biological organism. So it's actually termed a biofield because it's generated by a biological organism. Now, there's movements of ions in and out of trillions of cells in our body, and blood pumps all in a circuit around the body. What that does is it generates not only an electric field, but a magnetic field. So when it comes to energy healing, one way to understand, there's a few different ways to understand it, as I've written in the book, and it depends on how you look at it. But one way to understand it is your state as a healer matters significantly. So if your state is one of empathy, compassion, or you feel deeply aligned with the idea of service, I am here to serve, then what will happen is your field, the coherence, I guess, if you measured it with a magnetometer, you can, in fact, I've got a little device I put in my ear and I look at my heart rhythms. When you're in a state like that, then your heart rhythms or your heart rate variability, as it's called, is very stable. It's called coherent. Now that is only achieved when you're really in a stable, relaxed state, like empathy or compassion or how can I serve? Now the question is, does your state therefore impact the state of the other person? And absolutely it does. So therefore, as a healer, if you're in a state that says, I am here to serve, and I have empathy, compassion for you, then immediately, before you even do anything, there's an impact of your state on the person's state. And it's nothing like woo-woo. It's not a magical energy that scientists can't detect. It is actually, first of all, the way that your biofield guides or entrains, is to use the technical word in science. Your biofield can guide or entrain the biofield of the other person. And here's the interesting thing, is the state of a person's biofield is correlated with the state of the body. Just like, for example, if I had a plate of food, then the temperature of that food is correlated with the temperature of the environment. If I was to change the temperature of the environment, like put it in the oven, for example, then that will change the temperature of the food. So the food itself is correlated with its environment. In a similar way, the human body is correlated with the biofield that surrounds it. So it's not just that changes in you, how you feel, your state of empathy or compassion or how can I serve, that's affecting your biofield, but it goes the other way as well. The biofield itself will affect the body as well. So one way to understand energy healing is purely on the basis of the state of the healer will be impacting on the state of the patient or the client. So that's one way to understand it. But there is other ways as well, like the interaction of a person's consciousness with the other person's consciousness as well. And as I go further on in the book, I put compelling statistical data showing that your consciousness absolutely does impact on the consciousness of another person, but if and only if you're in a state of empathy, felt connection. If and only if, and I mean that really strongly, if and only if you're in a state of empathy. In other words, you establish as the healer a felt connection with the person, whether they're right here or even in another place. And there's lots of research on that, separating people and putting one person in an MRI scanner, for example. And again, the person's brain will react to the state of the other person, if and only if there's empathy, felt connection.
I love that you mentioned the term entrainment, because I think that's really key to help people understand how one body can send energy or entrain that energy into another body, separate body. And I've also read that term around how crystals work, in the sense that crystals have their own vibrational frequency, that when we place ourselves next to them, because it's stable, our unstable energy field can entrain to the stability of the crystal. Is there science behind that, or am I just making this up?
No. Again, it's a language thing. But see, for me, because I've known a lot of people over the years, having trained and did Reiki myself. I did crystal therapy 20 years ago as well. When I left the pharmaceutical industry, I did a PhD. I'd worked in a technical science environment after my PhD in, high pressure technical science environment. And I knew in my heart that there was something to be learned from a fusion of East and West. It doesn't have to be all just the Western stuff that I was working on. There was a fusion to be learned. There was something to be learned from a fusion of the two. So when I left the industry, I spent a year or two diving into different types of experiential stuff. I did shamanic journeys. I did Reiki. I did crystal healing for a year, every second month. And again, it comes down to a language thing. So quartz, for example, has a property that's called diamagnetic. Now, what diamagnetic means is it repels the Earth's magnetic field. Here's a good way to think about it. Let's say you're standing in the rain, and the rain is pouring down. If you then put an umbrella up, then what the umbrella will do is it will protect you from the rain, and the rain will then move over. And if there's someone standing beside you who doesn't have an umbrella, they're going to get twice as much rain, right? So what the umbrella does is it bends the path of the rain onto anything in the vicinity. So a diamagnetic substance does something very similar, but it's not bending the path of the rain, it's bending the path of the Earth's magnetic field. But what it's doing, it's bending it around itself, which means it's dumping more of it onto anything in the vicinity. So the question I posed in the book, given that quartz crystal is diamagnetic, absolutely anything close to a diamagnetic substance will get more of the Earth's magnetic field. So the Earth's magnetic field will be intensified around the vicinity of a crystal. So the question I posed is that significant? Now, research is at an early stage, but there does seem to be evidence in science in an area of research called plant magnetoreception that looks at the changes to the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field, and it absolutely has an effect on the rate of growth of plants. And right down to the genetic level, recent research shows that plants that have a diamagnetic element, zinc, in them, plant soils that have zinc, a diamagnetic mineral, the diamagnetism of the zinc actually alters the activity of a gene that controls iron uptake. Now, iron uptake is crucial for the use of, for how chlorophyll works. So in other words, if iron uptake is good, then a plant will be deep and green and will be dark green from the chlorophyll. So it turned out that greenness, the activity of a gene, was affected by the diamagnetism of zinc in the soil. Now, quartz crystal is diamagnetic as well. So I presented some of that evidence and left it as an open question and almost a challenge in science. Let's do some research on this, because in my opinion, the diamagnetism of quartz does actually have an impact on biological processes, but to what degree, I actually don't know, but I did a wee bit of testing myself on plants. And so here's the language thing. When you talk about a vibration, we might call it a vibration. To a physicist, they will call it its diamagnetic index, its degree of diamagnetism, or its paramagnetic index, because some minerals, some crystals have the opposite of an umbrella. They have a funnel, and they pull the Earth's magnetic field in and deprive it from the vicinity. But actually lowering the Earth's magnetic field can impact positively in plants as well. So someone in the spiritual arts might call it a vibration, but a physicist would call it its diamagnetic or paramagnetic index. It's just a language tweak, really. But it's the same idea.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and I think I'm just so used to talking with scientists about spirituality because my two best friends, one has a PhD in quantum physics, the other one has a PhD in epigenetics, and they're both spiritual. So I get to have these conversations, and because they get my spirituality, they translate it in their heads in a scientific way, and then they explain that to me, and it makes sense. But most people don't have that experience, and therefore, when they meet someone who's in a completely different field, and there's some clashing. So that's why I believe like this book is so important right now, because as you said, it's going to create this common ground for us to start having this conversation and pushing the envelope of research so that we can find more answers about that. Now, I love it.
Can I just say
Yes,
also
of
quickly
course.
that there is another way to understand the vibration as well, like the different colors of crystals. Now, to a physicist, a color is really just the frequency of light that bounces off photoreceptors. Pardon me, that bounces off photoreceptors in our eyes, and so different colors of crystals, in a sense, they have they vibrate in that sense, in the sense that light of a particular vibrational frequency bounces off them and is absorbed by the eye. So your physicist friend probably will understand it in that sense, that the different color of a crystal represents a different vibrational wavelength of light. And here's the thing, I've got a big section in that chapter of the book also about how different colored crystals impact us. And I explored the science of color psychology and how, for example, colors impact us dramatically. A study gave people a cherry flavored drink, but they put a green dye in it and made it look bright green. Do you know 37% of people couldn't taste cherry, and they could swear that it was lemon or lime? In other words, the brain processed the taste based on its color, based on what it should be given its color, rather than what it actually was. So in other words, there was a brain process being impacted by your perception of the color. So I explained, in terms of what we might call its vibration, I explained that different colored crystals, because of what color represents in the human psyche, will bring about actual effects in humans as well. So in terms of crystal jewelry and working with crystals, if you use a particular color through color psychology, it really can have an effect.
I love how multi-layered and how multidisciplinary your approach is, because you're not just seeing it from your the chemistry perspective. You're going to psychology, you're going to physics, and you're merging all of it together. I think that's a very well researched and well-rounded approach to seeing that. And I love that you also talked about nature and how nature is healing. And I mean, a lot of the alternative healing modalities out there are focused around nature. Something that I do myself, I'm working with flower essences, which are essentially the vibration of different plants and flowers, and you're allowing that vibration to work on the subtle layers of your being. Now, talking about nature in general, not specifically about flower essences, but essential oils, like there's so many different healing modalities. How is nature healing, and is nature healing?
Nature is absolutely healing. You know, the human species, in over eons, the human species and our predecessors have spent 99.99% of our time in nature and natural surroundings, and only 0.01% of our time in blocky, built-up surroundings. So the human body is attuned to natural surroundings. Now, in comparison with the average background level of stress that most people live with much of the time, our ancient ancestors lived in a state of relative calm, where the calm portion, or it's called the parasympathetic portion of the nervous system, was more dominant than it is for us today. For us today, the sympathetic, the stress response one, is more dominant. It's used much more often than it was back then. So because of over eons, that relative state of calm became associated with, in the psyche and in our biology, with green spaces and natural surroundings, with trees and grass and flowers and running water and the sounds of birds tweeting and bird song. And so nowadays, because that evolved over eons, nowadays, the moment we find ourselves in a green space, in a natural surrounding, the nervous system itself moves towards parasympathetic dominance. Now, I quoted lots of research that shows that actually happening. When scientists put people in a state of stress and they expose them to natural surroundings or blocky surroundings and watch how fast the nervous system returns to balance, and it returns significantly faster in people who are exposed to green spaces, even if it's just the image of one on a computer screen or the idea of one, which in terms might resonate with the idea of the little plant essences, the flower essences you use, the idea of it as well. In one really clever series of experiments, scientists in Norway measured the rate of recovery of hospital patients, half of whose window gave them a panoramic view of nature in the hills and valleys and forests and trees. The other half, their window offered them a view of a car park or another hospital building. The recovery rates of those who had the panoramic view of nature were faster in their mental and physical health than those who had the view of a brick wall. And it's not just because it looks kind of nice, there's an actual impact on the human nervous system. At the moment we experience natural surroundings, it's not just that it looks pretty or it looks nice. It's not like that. There's an actual physiological effect of the exposure to nature itself. So in that chapter, I listed loads of research showing that the sights of nature and the sounds of nature even impact the rate of recovery, not just from operations, but pain levels, pain thresholds, all these kind of things are impacted. Scientists duplicate a room in a hospital environment, but put flowers in one room and they measure the pain levels and the use of painkillers. And amazingly, people use less painkillers in rooms that have flowers in them versus plain rooms.
David, I 100% relate to that, and I have first-hand experience with it because last year, sadly, my dad passed away from cancer earlier this year, and I was with him throughout the whole process in the hospital, from room to room, from hospitals to hospital, and I noticed that in places, in hospitals where he was in a room with no windows, completely institutionalized, he would be more upset and it would take longer time for him to heal. And I would always go with my essential oils and my aura sprays, and I would just work my magic around the room, and then I could instantly feel him like lighting up. And even like in the evenings where he couldn't sleep and he was calling me like at 3 a.m. in the morning, I can't sleep, I'm in pain, I would go there with my essential oils. In 30 minutes he would like calm down and go to sleep. And my dad was the biggest muggle you've ever met. He did not believe in these kind of things, but as soon as he saw that it worked, he was reaching out to me like, George, can you please come do all the woo-woo stuff to me? And I would come and do Reiki and spray him with flower essences and do all that. So it's fascinating how when we feel something, when we experience something, our whole perspective changes. When people try to challenge me around spirituality, I'm like, experience it, and then you'll see for yourself. So don't judge it before you do that. David, thank you so much for sharing all these fabulous tools with us. And of course, everybody can read Why Woo Woo Works to get all the information, all the scientific information. I'm curious, before we finish, what's your hope for this book and the future of science and spirituality?
Well, I would like to see a closer integration of what we call mainstream and complementary practices. I think that the future represents a fusion of the two. I think there's a lot of situations where a person might benefit more, just as well, or even more from a restorative practice, any practice that eases the nervous system into a state of restoration. And so many complementary therapies do that very, very well. And indeed, and so I talked a wee bit about that. And I'd also like to see, less animosity between the two camps. I've always considered myself a bit of a peacemaker. I struggle in conflict. It impacts my nervous system. I feel anxious when people are in conflict and stuff. And so I really do struggle with that. And so I've always been motivated to try to bring conflicting sides together. And so in this book, I hope I've done a decent job in trying to explain the language for these people that these people use, and try to explain the language for these people that these people use, and say, look, we all have the same intentions. We want to help people. and there's just a wee bit of a language barrier. And if we just understand that there is a lot of science there, most of the woo-woo science is only known to people who are working actively in that research field. And so it's not that it's actually woo-woo, it just doesn't sound plausible to a lot of people because they don't know that research is there. So what I tried to do in the book is just say, let's be friends, let's understand each other. And I'm sure there is a happy fusion of East and West, something good to be found in the middle. And I don't even know what the actual answer is. It will evolve for itself. But there's something in the middle where we're all friends that is the future, I think.
It's definitely started to happen, because last year I did a university specialization in clinical aromatherapy. It's not practiced so much in Europe, but in the US there are so many hospitals that are bringing in clinical aromatherapists who work with clients instead of using pain medication, for example, like applying essential oils, and how this can work. So I'm excited to see how this goes. And David, can you please let everyone know where they can get a hold of the book and where they can get in touch with you?
Well, the book is available in Amazon and all bookshops and booksellers, I think. My website is where you can, get access to most of what I do, drdavidhamilton.com. And that's got links to my social media handles. So I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. But you can get all the links from my website.
Yes, and of course you can find all the links in the show notes below. David, thank you so much for coming on to the Lit Up Lightworker podcast. I love this conversation, so fascinating, and I can't wait for everyone to experience your magic and the magic of why woo-woo works.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks again for inviting me. It's been really great to catch up and have this little conversation.